Lusitani, and these guys have a reputation for being extremely good in melee and with having a lot of good cheap javelins that they can throw at your face, and the reputation is well deserved. It starts with these Lusitany Nobles that have a beastly melee attack but a low-ish weapon damage for being a barbarian sword unit, but they kind of make up for that by having 6 armor piercing damage, which is pretty good, and these guys are going to tear through most of the infantry units in the game. They have a good charge bonus, good melee defense, but they kind of fall through in the armor department because these shields are not going to be able to protect you well against missiles, and in prolonged melee, if you can rob these guys of their charge bonus and then charge in yourself, these guys are going to die. They don't have the shield wall, and that also hurts them defensively, because this good melee defense would work really well with shield wall, but their shields are too small to be used as with a shield wall. Then you have your Mercenary Iberian swords, or I call them Mercenary Iberian swords because I play Carthage a lot, but of course with the Iberian tribes they are only Iberian swords. These guys have a good melee attack, good weapon damage, decent charge, good melee defense, but they don't really have armor. But the special thing about these guys is that they can throw 120 javelins times 5 up to a range of 80, and they throw the Elite Soliferum iron javelins, so these guys do a lot of armor piercing damage. And if you can get these guys around to fire at the unshielded side of enemies, fire at chariots or elephants, they can pay for themselves many times over, and they're not completely useless when charging into melee either, because they have decent melee stats, and when rear charging, these guys can be really dangerous. And then we have the Lusitani Swordwomen, and these are kind of weird, because they have very good melee attack, they have decent amount of weapon damage, pretty crappy charge bonus, but it gets better with the frenzy charge. They have decent melee defense, but they don't really have armor, and good morale. So when they can do well, but you really want to keep these girls away from enemy missiles and enemy cavalry, and that really goes for all of the Iberian sword units. Keep them away from missiles and cavalry, get the charge and get them into melee as quickly as you can. Then we have the Guerrilla Warriors, and these guys are your standard stalking, able to deploy outside of the deployment Guerrilla Warriors, very difficult to use effectively in multiplayer. Then you have the Veteran Shield Warriors. I'm going to say that I think these guys are a bit overrated, because while they have an amazing melee attack, they have good weapon damage with high armor piercing, they have a good charge bonus and melee defense, they don't really have armor, and they're going to die to cavalry, they're going to die to missiles, and in prolonged melee engagements in rough terrain, there are a lot of infantry units that are going to be able to tank it out against the Veteran Shield Warriors. But on flat terrain, if you're able to get clean charges, these guys can do a lot of damage, but they will die quickly to other elites because of their lack of armor. And with their shield value of 5, they are not going to be blocking very many incoming enemy missiles either. And we have the Lusitary Nobles, and we looked at those with the generals options. For spears we have Lusitani Guerrillas, and these are your hybrid spearmen, because they are able to throw javelins, and they're able to fight in melee with spears afterwards. So pretty useful unit, but using the guerrilla deployment is going to be difficult, but you can use them close to your own lines to have a spear unit that is hidden, so can be useful for surprising light enemy cavalry with a shower of missiles, or maybe even surprising elephants that think they have a clean charge on some of your sword units. The Skittaro Spears, very cost-effective spear units. These are your first units that are really able to stop missiles with a 50% block chance on missiles. Decent armor, overall decent stats for a spear unit, good bonus versus large, pretty low melee attack, so they won't do well against enemy infantry, but they have the shield screen and the cavalry counter tactics, so these guys can take out a lot of enemy cavalry. And then we have the Lusitani Spears, and you might ask yourself why these guys are so much more expensive than your Iberian sword, than your Skittaro Spears when you look at the stats. But it's mainly higher weapon damage, higher melee defense, a bit lower armor, but much higher morale. So these guys are going to be able to hold for quite some time in melee, and more useful against infantry, but still you have so many other options that are good against infantry that I would really like to see the Skittaro Spears used against cavalry instead. You have your standard crappy Iberian Slingers, Then you have your Iberian Skirmishers, which are your standard, decent javelin units, good against elephants, chariots, cavalry if you get them in range. Then you have the Baleric Slingers, and these guys are the best slingers in the game. They put out 8 shots per minute, they have high armor piercing damage of 8, and they have pretty decent armor that is able to block, I think it's around 20 or 30% of incoming missiles. I don't remember at the top of my head, but they are going to be able to duke it out with enemy skirmishers fairly well because they block incoming missiles and they have a high rate of fire. Good morale also for a skirmishing unit. In the cavalry department, the Lusitani don't have many good options. They have the light Iberian Cavalry with high melee attack, good weapon damage, and they have swords, so they are going to be better against infantry than against cavalry. They have a good charge bonus, so if you can get these guys with frenzied charge into the enemy rear, they can get a lot of kills. But frontally and to missiles and to cavalry, these guys will die quickly. The Skittaro Cavalry, in my opinion, a bit overpriced. They have good melee attack, decent weapon damage and bonus versus large, a decent charge bonus, but their lack of armor really hurts them. They have the frenzied charge, which can be useful in a rear charging role and against enemy cavalry, but it's not the Lusitani's strongest suit. So, if you're going for a typical Lusitani sword rush, you might go for 4 nobles, you might go for some veteran shields, and depending on the faction you are facing, if you need some support against cavalry, you can bring your Skittaro Spearmen, you can bring your Skittaro Cavalry, mainly to block enemy cavalry charges. You also have the Cantabrian Cavalry, which is okay skirmishing cavalry, but your main strength is always going to be swords. So if you're going to go for a mix of elite and mid-tier swords, you can also go for some Iberian swords to function as javelin men before charging into melee, and this is going to help mitigate the lack of units that you have if you only go for elites. Now some people also like to bring fewer nobles and then bring some skirmishers, and that can absolutely work. It's nice to have some skirmishing capabilities, and going for either only Balerics or a mix of Balerics and these Iberian Slingers is going to give you some ranged firepower. Now you can do some funky stuff with your builds as well. If you want to go for a super elite 6 Lusitani Noble build and then go for Cantabrian Cavalry, 6 Cantabrian Cavalry to go up against enemy cavalry and to throw javelins at them, you can also go for Iberian swords for javelin support. This is a pretty fun type of build to play with, but it's going to struggle against many of the other builds in the game. If the enemy cavalry focuses on your Lusitany Nobles and then charges in with infantry, or uses his skirmishers to attack your Lusitany Nobles, then this type of build is going to quickly run into some problems. But you can also go for fewer Cantabrian Cavalry and then have some slingers of your own or some spears to protect you, but the Lusitani's strongest suit is always going to be its good sword units. So some people like to go for mainly tank up on veteran shield warriors, just have a noble general because you have to, and then bring a mix of Iberian swords, and now we can bring a lot of units with javelins, a mix of Iberian swords and spears and some cavalry. So that can absolutely work, but still you're going to bring a fairly vulnerable Lusitani build. If you want to have units that have a bit more ability to charge into melee than your standard Iberian swords, and you just want to go for a lot of units, you can even bring six of these Lusitani swordwomen in addition to that, 2 nobles, so now we're pretty rushy over here. And if you want to go pure sword and infantry, you can do that with the Lusitani, but still you're going to be very vulnerable to enemy cavalry and enemy skirmishers, because it's going to be hard to catch enemy skirmishers with this, and enemy cavalry is going to rob you of the most important thing you have as the Lusitani, and that is your charge bonuses, because the charge bonuses on these nobles and these veteran shields, you absolutely have to get the charge bonus and kill a lot of enemy infantry so they aren't able to grind it out against you in a prolonged melee. So that's it for the Lusitani. Pretty fun faction to play with, but they do suffer from the lack of good cavalry options.